Vincent Romano had the world at his fingertips, literally. As one of the most celebrated pianists of his generation, he could sell out any concert hall in any city within hours. His performances were legendary. Critics called him a genius. Fans called him a god. And somewhere along the way, Vincent started to believe them. At 42 years old, he had already achieved what most musicians only dream about. 3 Grammy Awards sat on his mantelpiece. His recordings topped classical music charts. Concert venues fought over booking dates years in advance. He commanded fees that made other performers jealous. Magazine covers, television appearances, private performances for billionaires and royalty. Vincent had it all, and he knew it, but success had changed him. The young man who once practiced 12 hours a day out of pure love for music had become something else entirely. He was difficult, demanding, cruel to his staff. He fired assistants over minor mistakes. He walked out of rehearsals if conditions weren't perfect. Orchestra conductors dreaded working with him. His manager, a patient woman named Patricia who had been with him for 15 years, spent half her time apologizing for his behavior. "You're burning bridges, Vincent," she warned him one afternoon in his Milan hotel suite. They were reviewing upcoming performance requests. Vincent barely looked up from his phone. "I don't need bridges. People come to me, and they did. That was the problem. No matter how badly he behaved, the invitations kept coming. The money kept flowing. The applause never stopped." Vincent had learned that talent could excuse almost anything, so when the invitation arrived from the Vatican, Vincent's first reaction was to laugh. "They want me to play at some religious ceremony?" he said, tossing the embossed letter onto the table. "Sacred music celebration? What is this, the Middle Ages?" Patricia picked up the letter carefully. The Vatican seal gleamed in gold. "Vincent, this is an honor. The Pope himself will be present. They're celebrating the restoration of one of their historic organs. They want you to perform alongside it." "The Pope." Vincent said the word like it tasted bad. "An old man in fancy robes. Why would I waste my time?" "Because it's the Vatican. Because millions of people will see this. Because it's good for my image?" Vincent interrupted. "Is that what you're going to say? That I should pretend to be humble and spiritual for the cameras?" Patricia sighed. She had been down this road with him before. "The fee is substantial, and they're offering to make a significant donation to a music charity in your name." Vincent's eyes flickered with interest, not because of the charity, but because of what Patricia wasn't saying. This kind of exposure, this kind of cultural prestige, it opened doors, not just to concert halls, but to the kinds of exclusive circles where real power lived. Performing at the Vatican wasn't just about music. It was about status. "Fine," he said finally, "but I'm playing what I want to play. Not some boring hymn. They can take it or leave it." Patricia knew better than to argue. She sent the acceptance. 3 weeks later, Vincent arrived in Rome. He hated it immediately. The crowds, the tourists, the heat, the ancient buildings that everyone seemed to worship like they were something special. He checked into his 5-star hotel and complained about the room. Too small. Too noisy. The view wasn't good enough. The staff scrambled to move him to the presidential suite. The day before the performance, Vatican officials arranged a rehearsal and tour. Vincent showed up an hour late, wearing sunglasses indoors and looking annoyed. A young priest greeted him at the entrance. "Maestro Romano, what an honor. We are so grateful you could—" "Where's the piano?" Vincent cut him off. The priest's smile faltered. "Of course. Right this way." As they walked through the marble halls, the priest tried to explain the significance of the event. "The organ we're celebrating is nearly 400 years old. It was played by some of the greatest composers in history. Tomorrow's ceremony will bring together sacred and classical music in a way that—" "Is the piano tuned properly?" Vincent interrupted again. "Yes, we had our finest technician. I'll need to hear it first. I've worked with enough amateurs to know that finest doesn't mean much." The priest fell silent. They continued walking. When they reached St. Peter's Basilica, even Vincent had to pause. The space was massive. Light poured through ancient windows. The ceiling seemed to touch heaven itself. Thousands of people would fill these pews tomorrow. At the front, positioned on a raised platform, sat a magnificent grand piano. But Vincent wasn't looking at the beauty around him. He was calculating angles, acoustics, sight lines. Where would the cameras be? Where would the important people sit? "The Holy Father will be seated here," the priest said, gesturing to a special chair near the front. He's very much looking forward to your performance." Vincent walked to the piano without responding. He sat down, adjusted the bench with exaggerated movements, and began to play. Technical scales. Testing the sound. His fingers moved with mechanical precision. The acoustics were actually incredible. Vincent hated admitting it, but the sound filled the basilica perfectly. Still, he kept his expression bored. "The piano needs work," he lied. "The middle C is flat." The priest looked worried. "I'll have the technician return immediately." "Never mind. I'll make do." Vincent stood up. "Is there anything else, or can I leave?" That evening, back at his hotel, Vincent met Patricia for dinner. She could tell he was in one of his moods. How was the rehearsal? Tedious. These people treat that building like it's special. It's just old stone and paintings? Vincent, please tell me you'll behave tomorrow. This is important. He swirled his wine. I'll play. That's what they're paying for. They're not paying for me to pretend I care about their religion. Just don't make jokes. Don't say anything that could what? Offend them? Vincent smirked. Patricia, I've spent my whole career being told what I can and can't do. I'm done with that. Tomorrow I'll play my music, collect my fee, and forget this whole thing. But deep down, beneath the arrogance and the attitude, something else was brewing. Vincent had spent so long believing he was untouchable that he'd forgotten a simple truth. Pride comes before the fall. And tomorrow, in front of thousands of people and millions watching around the world, Vincent Romano was about to learn that some moments change everything. He just didn't know it yet. The next morning arrived with clear blue skies over Rome. Vincent dressed in his finest black suit. He styled his hair perfectly. He practiced his confident walk in the mirror. Everything had to be perfect. This was his show, even if it was happening in someone else's building. As his car pulled up to the Vatican, crowds lined the streets. Cameras flashed. People shouted his name. Vincent waved with practiced ease, the famous smile that had graced 100 magazine covers. Inside, the basilica was filling with people. Cardinals in red, bishops in purple, dignitaries from around the world, members of the press, and regular faithful believers who had waited in line for hours just to be present for this special event. Vincent was escorted to a private room to wait. Through the walls, he could hear the murmur of the gathering crowd. Someone knocked on his door. Maestro, 5 minutes. Vincent checked himself one more time in the mirror. Perfect. He walked toward the basilica, his footsteps echoing on ancient stone. This was it. Another performance. Another crowd. Another triumph. But as he stepped into that sacred space and saw the Pope taking his seat at the front, something dark and arrogant rose up inside Vincent. All these people, all this ceremony, all this reverence for one old man. Vincent felt the urge to remind everyone who they had really come to see. He had no idea that in just a few moments, everything was about to change. The basilica was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Vincent walked slowly down the center aisle, very aware that every eye was on him. This was the moment he lived for. The attention, the awe, the power of being the center of everything. Cameras tracked his movement. News crews from around the world had set up their equipment. This wasn't just a Vatican event anymore. It was being broadcast live to millions of viewers across the globe. Vincent knew exactly how to work a crowd. He moved with confidence, his chin slightly raised, his expression serious but approachable. The perfect artist preparing to share his gift. As he passed the rows of clergy, he caught fragments of whispered Latin prayers. Candles flickered along the walls. The smell of incense hung in the air. Everything about this place was designed to make you feel small, to make you bow your head in reverence. Vincent refused. He kept his eyes forward, his posture straight. He wasn't here to bow. Near the front, he saw the Pope. The elderly man sat quietly in his ceremonial chair, hands folded, eyes closed. He looked frail, vulnerable, human. Around him, cardinals and bishops stood like guards protecting something precious. The whole scene struck Vincent as theatrical. Costume drama, an elaborate show of power disguised as humility. Vincent reached the platform and stepped up to the piano. The instrument gleamed under the lights. Behind him, the massive pipe organ rose toward the ceiling like a monument. 2 priests stood ready to play it during their portion of the program. But everyone knew the real star of this event was the man at the piano. A Vatican official approached the microphone positioned near the piano. He was an older man with kind eyes, wearing simple robes. He began to speak in Italian, then switched to English. Welcome everyone to this sacred celebration. Today we honor 4 centuries of musical tradition as we commemorate the restoration of our historic organ. We are blessed to have with us one of the world's finest pianists, Maestro Vincent Romano, who will grace us with his extraordinary talent. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Vincent nodded slightly, acknowledging it without really reacting. He'd heard bigger ovations. The official continued. Music has always been a bridge between heaven and earth, a way for us to touch the divine. In the presence of His Holiness and all gathered here, we invite Maestro Romano to begin. The official stepped away from the microphone. The basilica fell silent. This was Vincent's moment. He should have simply sat down and played. That was the plan. That was what everyone expected. But something inside Vincent stirred. Maybe it was the weight of all that reverence in the air. Maybe it was the way everyone looked at the Pope with such devotion. Maybe it was just his ego, swollen beyond reason after years of unchecked success. Whatever it was, Vincent couldn't help himself. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, just close enough for his voice to carry. You know, he said, his tone casual, almost conversational. I've played for presidents and prime ministers, kings and queens, some of the most powerful people in the world. He paused, letting his eyes drift toward where the Pope sat. But I have to admit, this is my first time playing for someone whose main qualification is wearing an interesting wardrobe. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence that followed was different from the reverent quiet of before. This silence was shock, horror, disbelief. In the front rows, a cardinal's face went pale. Another closed his eyes as if in pain. Patricia, sitting near the back, put her hand over her mouth. The young priest who had given Vincent the tour yesterday looked like he might cry. A few people in the crowd gasped. Others sat frozen, unsure if they had really heard what they thought they heard. Did he just mock the Pope? Did that really happen? Vincent saw the reactions and felt a surge of satisfaction. There, he'd reminded them. This wasn't just about their religion or their traditions. This was about talent, real measurable talent, and he had it. That old man in the chair didn't. The Pope himself hadn't moved. His eyes remained closed. His face showed no reaction at all. He sat there like a statue, completely still, seemingly lost in prayer or meditation. Either he hadn't heard the comment or he was choosing not to acknowledge it. Vincent smirked slightly and turned to the piano. Enough games. Time to play and prove his point. Time to show them what real mastery looked like. He sat down on the bench, adjusted his position, stretched his fingers briefly. He had planned to play a piece by Rachmaninoff, something powerful and virtuosic, something that would make everyone forget about sacred music and remember what a real performer could do. His hands moved to the keys. He took a breath. The basilica waited. Thousands of people, millions watching on screens around the world, all eyes on him. This was what he loved. This was everything. Vincent pressed down on the first keys. The notes that came out were not the ones he intended. His fingers moved, yes. The keys went down under his touch. But the music that filled the basilica was completely different from what he had planned. It wasn't Rachmaninoff. It wasn't even anything he recognized. It was something else entirely. The melody was slow, hauntingly beautiful. It had the quality of ancient hymns, but with a complexity that seemed beyond human composition. The notes seemed to come from somewhere deep, somewhere he couldn't name. His fingers moved across the keys with a grace he hadn't put there, playing passages he'd never learned. Vincent's eyes widened. What was happening? He tried to stop, tried to pull his hands away. But they wouldn't obey. His fingers continued their journey across the keyboard, pressing keys and patterns he didn't recognize, creating music he'd never heard before. Panic rose in his chest. This wasn't possible. He was in control. He was always in control. He was Vincent Romano. He decided what to play. He decided when to stop. His hands were his instruments. They obeyed him, but not now. The music continued to flow. It grew more complex, more beautiful, more impossible. His left hand played a bass line that resonated through the marble floors. His right hand danced across the higher notes with a delicacy he didn't know he possessed. The two hands worked together in perfect harmony, creating something that sounded like it was being channeled from another world. People in the audience leaned forward. The shock of his earlier comment began to fade, replaced by something else: confusion, wonder, awe. This music was not what anyone had expected. It didn't sound like Vincent's usual style. It didn't sound like anything from this century at all. Vincent's heart pounded. Sweat began to form on his forehead. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run, but his body wouldn't move. Only his hands moved, only his fingers dancing across the keys like they belonged to someone else. The melody shifted. Minor keys gave way to major chords. Sadness transformed into something that felt like hope. The music swelled, filling every corner of the massive basilica. It seemed to seep into the stones themselves. The ancient walls that had stood for centuries seemed to vibrate with this impossible song. And then Vincent felt something even stranger. Tears. They started without warning. First just a stinging in his eyes, then a wetness on his cheeks, then full tears streaming down his face. He wasn't sad. He wasn't happy. He didn't know what he was. But the tears kept coming. His vision blurred. His chest tightened. What was this? What was happening to him? The music grew louder, more intense, more overwhelming. His fingers flew across the keys now, faster than he'd ever played before, but with perfect precision. Every note crystal clear. Every phrase perfectly shaped. It was the best playing of his life, and he had no control over it whatsoever. In the front row, the Pope's eyes opened. The elderly man looked directly at Vincent. There was no anger in that gaze. No judgment. Just something deep and knowing, something that made Vincent's tears flow even harder. He tried again to stop playing, tried to force his hands to be still, but the music wouldn't end. His fingers wouldn't obey, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the panic and the fear and the confusion, Vincent felt something breaking. Something that had been hard and cold inside him for so long was starting to crack. The audience sat transfixed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just listened as this impossible music continued to pour from the piano. Some people had tears in their own eyes now. Others sat with their mouths slightly open, barely breathing. Vincent's whole body began to shake. Not from the effort of playing, from something else, something he couldn't name, something he'd never felt before in his entire life. And still the music played on. The music continued to pour out of Vincent like water from a broken dam. 5 minutes passed. Then 6, then 7. Each moment felt like an eternity. His fingers never faltered, never missed a note. They moved with a precision that went beyond anything he'd trained for, beyond anything his years of practice had given him. But it wasn't just the technical perfection that shocked him. It was the emotion. Every note carried a weight he'd never experienced before. When he played high notes, they sang with a joy that made his heart ache. When the melody dropped into lower registers, it spoke of sorrow so profound he could barely breathe. This wasn't just music. This was something alive, something with a voice of its own. Vincent's tears kept flowing. They dripped onto the keys, making them slick under his fingers. But his playing never stopped, never slowed. The moisture didn't matter. Nothing mattered except this unstoppable force moving through him. His mind raced with panic. How long would this last? What if it never stopped? What if he was trapped here forever, a prisoner to this mysterious music? The thought terrified him. But beneath the terror, something else was growing. Something he didn't want to acknowledge. The music began to change again. It started asking questions. At least that's how it felt to Vincent. The melody would rise with what sounded like a question, then pause, waiting for an answer that never came. Who are you? It seemed to ask. Not who you pretend to be. Not the famous pianist. Not the genius. Who are you really underneath all of that? Vincent didn't want to answer. Didn't want to look. He'd spent so many years building walls around the truth. The truth was uncomfortable. The truth was that beneath all his success and talent and fame, Vincent was just a scared man who had decided that being worshipped was easier than being real. The melody pressed harder. It moved into minor keys that felt like fingers probing a wound. When did you forget why you started? When did music stop being about beauty and start being about ego? When did you become this person who mocks an old man for trying to serve something greater than himself? "Stop," Vincent wanted to say, but he couldn't speak. His jaw was clenched, his whole body rigid except for those endlessly moving hands. The music showed him things, not in pictures but in feelings. He felt what it was like to be his assistant, fired over a forgotten phone charger. The humiliation, the fear of losing a job. He felt what it was like to be the orchestra members he'd berated for minor mistakes. The shame, the anger they couldn't express because he had all the power. He felt what it was like to be Patricia, constantly apologizing for his behavior, watching someone she'd believed in become someone she could barely recognize. Vincent sobbed now. Full gasping sobs, but still his hands played. The music was relentless. It wouldn't let him hide from what he'd become. 9 minutes. 10 minutes. The piece grew in complexity. His right hand played melodies that soared toward the basilica ceiling. His left hand created harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself. Together they wove something that felt both ancient and brand new, something that belonged in this sacred space, even though Vincent had never wanted to respect that sacredness. People in the audience were crying now too. Some of them didn't know why. They just knew that something extraordinary was happening, something they'd never witnessed before. The music was reaching into them, touching places they usually kept hidden. Even the cardinals who had been so horrified by Vincent's mockery found tears on their cheeks. The Pope remained perfectly still. His eyes stayed locked on Vincent. That gaze held no triumph. No satisfaction at watching this arrogant man brought low. Just a deep compassion, a recognition of what was happening. This old man had probably seen a lot in his life, but even he seemed to understand that this moment was special, sacred in a way that went beyond ceremony or tradition. Vincent's shoulders shook with sobs. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to be anywhere but here, exposed in front of thousands of people. But more than that, a tiny part of him was starting to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Not since he was young. Not since music was still pure for him. He was feeling grateful. Grateful that something, whatever it was, cared enough to stop him. To break through his armor. To show him what he'd become before it was too late to change. The music began to slow. After 11 minutes of this impossible performance, the tempo decreased. The notes came further apart. The melody simplified, returning to something that sounded like the beginning but transformed. What had started as a question now sounded like an answer, or maybe an invitation. Vincent's sobs quieted, his breathing steadied. But the tears kept coming. They weren't panicked tears anymore. They were something else, something that felt like release. The final phrases of the piece were gentle, almost tender. His right hand played a simple melody in the upper register. His left hand provided soft, supporting chords. It sounded like a lullaby, like a father singing to a child, like forgiveness offered before it was even asked for. And then, after 12 minutes of playing music he'd never learned, music that had played him rather than the other way around, Vincent's hands finally came to rest. The last note faded into the vast silence of the basilica. It echoed off the marble walls, the ancient columns, the painted ceiling. It seemed to hang in the air for a long moment, like the space itself didn't want to let it go. Then nothing. Complete silence. Vincent's hands lay still on the keys. His chest heaved. His face was wet with tears and sweat. His whole body trembled. He felt emptied out, hollowed, like everything he'd been carrying for years had been poured out through his fingers onto those keys. He couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't process what had just happened. The silence stretched on. Nobody in the audience moved. Nobody knew what to do. How do you respond to something like that? How do you applaud when you've just witnessed something that felt less like a performance and more like a transformation? Then Vincent heard movement. Quiet footsteps approaching the platform. He couldn't look up. Couldn't raise his head. He stayed bent over the piano, his forehead nearly touching the keys, his body racked with silent sobs. The footsteps came closer. They were slow, careful. The steps of someone old but determined. Vincent knew who it was. Of course he knew. But he couldn't face him. Couldn't look into the eyes of the man he'd mocked just minutes before. The shame was too great. The humiliation too complete. The footsteps reached the platform. Someone climbed the few steps slowly. Vincent heard breathing. Felt a presence next to him. Then he felt something else. A hand. Gentle. Weathered. It rested on his shoulder with a weight that was both light and impossibly heavy. Vincent's sobs grew louder. The kindness of that touch broke something else inside him, something that had been holding together the last pieces of his pride. It all came crashing down. "I'm sorry," Vincent choked out. His voice was barely a whisper, barely audible. "I'm so sorry." The hand on his shoulder squeezed gently. The Pope said nothing at first. He just stood there, this man who had every right to be angry, who had been publicly mocked in his own church, on his own stage, in front of his own people. He stood there and offered comfort instead of condemnation. After a long moment, the Pope leaned down. His voice was quiet, heavily accented, but clear. He spoke so only Vincent could hear. "God does not humiliate us, my son. He reveals us. What you just played was not punishment. It was a gift, a glimpse of what you were meant to be, what you still can be if you choose." Vincent looked up for the first time. His vision was blurred with tears, but he could see the Pope's face. The lined skin, the kind eyes, the gentle smile. There was no anger there, no judgment, just an acceptance so complete it made Vincent want to weep all over again. "How?" Vincent whispered. "How did that happen?" "I didn't know that music. I couldn't stop my hands." The Pope's smile deepened slightly. "There are some things we cannot explain. We can only experience them and be grateful." He paused. "You have been given a great talent, but today you were given something greater, a moment of grace. What you do with it now is up to you." Vincent nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat was too tight, but he understood, or at least he was beginning to. The Pope straightened slowly, his old bones protesting the movement. He gave Vincent's shoulder one last gentle squeeze, then turned to walk back to his seat. The audience watched in absolute silence as the elderly pontiff made his way down the platform steps and returned to his chair. Only then did people begin to react. The applause started slowly. One person, then two, then a handful. Within seconds, the entire basilica erupted. But it wasn't the usual applause Vincent was used to. This wasn't the polite clapping of concert halls or the enthusiastic cheering of fans. This was something different, something reverent. People stood, their hands coming together not in celebration of a performance but in acknowledgement of something sacred they'd witnessed. Vincent remained at the piano, unable to move. His legs felt weak. His arms hung at his sides. The sound of thousands of people applauding washed over him, but it felt distant, muffled, like he was underwater. Nothing felt real anymore. Patricia pushed through the crowd and rushed to the platform. When she reached him, her face was a mixture of concern and confusion. She'd managed Vincent's career for 15 years. She'd seen him perform hundreds of times. She'd never seen anything like this. "Vincent," she said quietly, touching his arm, "we need to get you out of here." He looked at her but didn't seem to recognize her at first. His eyes were red and swollen from crying. His face was pale. He looked like a man who'd just survived a car crash. "What happened?" he whispered. "Patricia, what just happened to me?" She had no answer. "I don't know, but we need to go." "Can you walk?" He nodded slowly. With Patricia supporting his arm, Vincent stood on shaky legs. The applause continued as they made their way off the platform. People reached out to touch him as he passed, not like fans trying to grab a celebrity, but like pilgrims touching something holy. Vincent barely noticed. Vatican officials tried to restore order. They announced that the ceremony would continue with the organ performance, but everyone knew that what came next wouldn't matter. The moment had already happened. Whatever was supposed to occur at this event had been eclipsed by those 12 impossible minutes. Patricia led Vincent through a side door, away from the crowds. They ended up in a small chapel, empty and quiet. Vincent collapsed onto a wooden bench. He put his face in his hands. "I mocked him," Vincent said, his voice hollow, in front of everyone. "I mocked the Pope. I was so arrogant, so stupid. Vincent, I don't understand what happened out there. That music you played. What was that?" "I don't know." He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. "I didn't choose it. I couldn't stop it. My hands just moved on their own. And it showed me things, Patricia. It showed me what I've become. How cruel I've been. How empty." Patricia sat down beside him. She'd been angry at Vincent more times than she could count. She'd thought about quitting dozens of times. But seeing him like this, so broken and vulnerable, she felt only compassion. "What do you want to do?" she asked gently. "I don't know." I don't know anything anymore. They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, they could hear the muffled sound of the organ playing, the ceremony continuing, life moving forward. But Vincent felt stuck, frozen in this moment of transformation that he didn't understand. Eventually, Patricia helped him back to the hotel. By the time they arrived, Vincent's phone had exploded with messages. News outlets, concert promoters, other musicians. Everyone wanted to know about the performance. Video clips were already spreading across social media. People were calling it a miracle. Others were looking for rational explanations. Nervous breakdown. Artistic episode. Mass hysteria. Vincent turned off his phone. He couldn't face any of it. That night he didn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying those 12 minutes over and over in his mind. The feeling of losing control. The terror. The tears. The music that came from somewhere beyond him. The Pope's hand on his shoulder. Those words, a moment of grace. The next morning, Patricia knocked on his door. "Vincent, you have interviews scheduled. People want to hear from you. This is the biggest moment of your career. Cancel them," he said. "What? Cancel all of them. I'm not doing interviews." "Vincent, everyone is talking about what happened. You need to control the narrative. I need to be alone." Patricia stared at him. "For how long?" "I don't know." Over the following days, Vincent did something he'd never done before. He withdrew. Completely. He stopped answering emails, stopped taking calls. Concert venues that had been begging for his presence suddenly couldn't reach him. Television producers offering interview opportunities got no response. The music world buzzed with speculation. Some said he was having a breakdown. Others claimed it was all a publicity stunt. Theories spread like wildfire. But Vincent didn't care. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't care what people thought. He spent days walking through Rome, not the tourist sites. Just walking through neighborhoods, past churches, sitting in small cafes, watching people live their ordinary lives. He'd traveled the world but never really seen it. Always rushing from hotel to venue to airport. Always focused on the next performance. The next review. The next achievement. Now he just walked and thought. And felt things he'd been too busy to feel for years. One afternoon, he found himself in front of a small church. Not a famous one. Just a neighborhood parish with an old wooden door. Something drew him inside. The space was simple. A few rows of pews, plain walls, a small altar. No tourists, no grandeur. Just quiet. Vincent sat in a back pew. He hadn't been to church since he was a child. His parents had taken him, but he'd stopped going the moment he left home. Religion was for people who needed comfort, he'd thought. He was above needing comfort. Now, sitting in this simple space, he felt something shift inside him. Not dramatic like at the Vatican, just a gentle settling, like something coming to rest after being in motion too long. An old priest shuffled out from a side room. He saw Vincent and nodded pleasantly, then began straightening candles on the altar. He didn't recognize Vincent. Didn't know he was famous. Vincent felt grateful for that. After a while, Vincent spoke. "Father?" The priest turned. "Yes, my son? Do you believe in miracles?" The old priest smiled. "I do, but not the flashy kind most people imagine. The real miracles are the quiet ones, the changes that happen inside people. When someone who was lost finds their way. When someone who was hard becomes soft. Those are the miracles I see." Vincent nodded slowly. What if someone did something terrible? Said something cruel? Can they come back from that? The priest walked over and sat a few pews away, respecting Vincent's space. Coming back is what we're all trying to do. Every day, we all say things we regret, do things we're ashamed of. The question isn't whether we can come back. It's whether we're willing to. How do you know if you're willing? You start. Even if you don't know where you're going, you just start. Vincent sat with those words. They felt true. Simple but true. He stayed in Rome for 3 more weeks. Patricia called every day at first, then less frequently. She was worried, but also knew better than to push. Something was happening to Vincent. Something important. She could hear it in his voice the few times he did answer. Concert venues began canceling his bookings. Some angrily, some with concern. His absence was costing people money. Disappointing fans. creating chaos in the carefully planned world of classical music performances. Vincent felt guilty about that, but not enough to go back, not yet. He wasn't ready. He started playing piano again, but differently. He found a small music school and asked if he could use their practice room. They recognized him, of course, but they were kind enough not to make a fuss. He'd play for hours, but not his usual repertoire. He played simple pieces, old hymns, children's songs, music that made him feel something pure. He also started writing, not music at first, just thoughts in a journal, trying to understand what had happened to him, trying to piece together who he was versus who he'd pretended to be. One entry read, "I spent 20 years building a castle made of pride. It took 12 minutes to knock it down. Now I'm sitting in the rubble and I don't know how to build anything else. But maybe that's okay. Maybe I need to sit here for a while. Maybe I need to learn how to build with different materials." Another entry, "I always thought being loved for my talent was enough. But that Pope looked at me with nothing but compassion even after I mocked him. He didn't love my talent. He loved me, the real me, the broken me. I don't think anyone has done that in years. I don't think I've let them." Slowly, very slowly, something was forming in Vincent. Not a plan exactly, but a direction. A sense that his life needed to be about something more than applause and reviews. He didn't know what that meant yet. Didn't know what it would look like. But he was beginning to understand that the music at the Vatican hadn't destroyed him. It had cracked him open, and now light was getting in. 3 months after the Vatican incident, Vincent finally returned to his apartment in New York. The place felt foreign to him. The awards on the walls, the expensive furniture, the framed magazine covers with his face on them. It all belonged to someone else. Someone he used to be. Patricia came to visit the day after he arrived. She brought coffee and sat across from him in his living room. She studied his face carefully. He looked different, thinner, older maybe, but also somehow more alive than she'd seen him in years. "You look like you've made a decision," she said. Vincent nodded. "I have." "Tell me." He took a breath. This was harder than he expected. "I'm done, Patricia, with all of it. The concerts, the recordings, the performances. I'm walking away." She didn't look surprised. "I had a feeling. What are you going to do instead?" "I'm entering seminary. I'm going to study theology, maybe become a priest. I don't know exactly where it leads, but I know it's what I need to do." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. It was sad but genuine. "I think that's the first completely honest thing I've heard you say in 10 years. I've been a terrible person to work for. I know that. I'm sorry." "You were difficult," she agreed. "But I stayed because I believed in your talent, and I was right to believe. What happened at the Vatican proved that. You have a gift, Vincent. It's not my gift. That's what I learned. It was never mine. It was given to me. I was supposed to use it for something bigger than myself. Instead, I used it to build a throne and sit on it." He paused. "I can't do that anymore." "So you'll never play again?" "I don't know. Maybe someday. But differently. Not for fame, not for money. Not to prove I'm better than everyone else." Patricia reached across and squeezed his hand. "I'm going to miss working with you. But I think you're doing the right thing." The news broke 2 weeks later. Vincent Romano, one of the world's most celebrated pianists, was retiring from public performance to pursue religious studies. The classical music world erupted in shock. Social media exploded with reactions. Some people thought he'd lost his mind. Others saw it as the ultimate publicity stunt. A few understood it for what it was, a genuine transformation. Concert promoters threatened lawsuits. Venues that had booked him years in advance scrambled to find replacements. His record label issued a statement expressing disappointment. The whole machinery of his career, built over decades, ground to a halt. Vincent didn't respond to any of it. He'd already made his peace with letting it all go. He sold his apartment, donated most of his money to music education programs for underprivileged children, kept only what he needed. He gave his most valuable piano, a rare Steinway worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, to a music school in a poor neighborhood. When they asked why, he said, "Because I forgot that music is supposed to serve others, not ourselves." The seminary he entered was quiet and simple, far from the spotlight. The other students were younger, mostly in their 20s. Vincent was 42, starting over like a freshman. It was humbling, but humility was exactly what he needed. The days were structured: prayer, study, service, work. Everything Vincent's old life wasn't. No applause, no reviews, no cameras, just learning, growing, becoming something new. He struggled at first. His ego wasn't gone, just wounded. It would flare up sometimes. He'd catch himself thinking he was above certain tasks, too talented to be cleaning floors or washing dishes. Then he'd remember that moment at the Vatican, his hands playing music he couldn't control. The tears, the Pope's gentle hand on his shoulder, and he'd go back to work with a quieter heart. The other seminarians eventually learned who he was. Videos of the Vatican performance still circulated online, but they treated him like anyone else, maybe even with a little extra scrutiny, making sure he was serious about this path. Vincent appreciated that. He didn't want special treatment. One evening, about 6 months into his studies, his theology professor pulled him aside. "I watched what happened at the Vatican," the professor said. "The video, I've watched it probably 50 times. Vincent tensed. He rarely talked about that day. "I show it to my students sometimes," the professor continued. "Not as entertainment, as an example of what can happen when God breaks through our defenses, when grace interrupts our plans." "It terrified me," Vincent admitted. "I thought I was going crazy." "I'm sure you did. But here's what I want you to understand. What happened to you wasn't punishment. It was an invitation. You could have ignored it, gone back to your old life, chalked it up to stress or coincidence, but you didn't. You said yes to the invitation. That takes courage. It doesn't feel like courage. It feels like I didn't have a choice." The professor smiled. "You always have a choice. That's the whole point. God doesn't force us, he invites. You could have walked away, but you stayed, you changed. That's all grace can do. The rest is up to us." Vincent thought about those words often in the months that followed. He was changing, slowly, but really changing. The anger that used to simmer under his surface was fading. The need to be praised all the time was loosening its grip. He was learning to find joy in small things: a good conversation, a sunrise, the satisfaction of helping someone understand a difficult concept. He still played piano occasionally. There was one in the chapel. Sometimes late at night, when everyone else was asleep, he'd sit at it and play. But never that piece from the Vatican. He couldn't. He'd tried once, just to see if he could remember it. But the moment his fingers touched the keys, he knew. That music wasn't his to play again. It had been given to him once, for one specific moment. To play it again would be like trying to recreate magic. You can't. You can only be grateful it happened. A year and a half after entering seminary, Vincent received an unexpected letter. It was from the Vatican, from the Pope himself. The handwriting was shaky, but clear. "Dear Vincent," it read, "I have been praying for you since that day we met. I want you to know that what happened was not meant to shame you. It was meant to wake you up. I believe it succeeded. I hear you are studying to serve God in a new way. This brings me great joy. Your talent was always meant to point beyond itself. Now you understand that. May you continue to grow in grace and humility. You are in my prayers. With affection and blessing." Vincent read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his Bible. Some days, when doubt crept in, when he wondered if he'd made the right choice giving up everything he'd worked for, he'd take out that letter and read it again. And remember, 2 years after the Vatican incident, Vincent was ordained. Not as a priest yet. That would take more time. But he took his first vows, stood before a small congregation and promised his life to something bigger than himself. Patricia came to the ceremony. So did a few of Vincent's old musician friends, people who'd known him before. They barely recognized him. not just because he wore simple robes instead of expensive suits, but because his face had changed. The hardness was gone. The arrogance that used to shine in his eyes had been replaced by something softer, something real. After the ceremony, Patricia hugged him. "You look happy," she said. "I am," Vincent replied, and he meant it. Years later, people still asked about that day at the Vatican. What really happened? Was it a miracle, a breakdown, mass hypnosis? Scientists and skeptics offered theories. Believers saw the hand of God. Vincent himself stopped trying to explain it. When pressed, he'd simply say, "Something broke in me that needed to break. Something opened that needed to open." Whether you call it God or grace or the universe or my own subconscious doesn't really matter to me anymore. What matters is that I was heading toward destruction, and I was stopped. I was given a chance to choose differently, and I took it. The recording of those 12 minutes became the most requested piece of music in Vatican history. People played it at weddings, funerals, prayer services. They said it brought them peace, made them think about their own lives, inspired them to make changes. Vincent never listened to it. He didn't need to. He'd lived it. That was enough. He spent his remaining years in service. Teaching music to children, counseling people struggling with pride and ego, living simply, praying, growing, being useful in quiet ways. And sometimes, very rarely, when the moment felt right and the purpose was pure, he'd sit at a piano and play. Not for applause, not for recognition, not to prove anything, just to let the music speak, to point beyond itself toward something beautiful and true, because in the end, that's what it had always been meant to do.